Hello everyone, in this video I'm going to show you how to calculate Pearson's correlation. So this is the formula for the correlation, and I know that it might look a little bit intimidating, but once we break it down, it's actually quite easy. There's just a couple places that you need to be careful so that you don't make mistakes. I'll go through that with you. So whenever I do these sort of calculations with all these different variables that we need to be looking at, I like to create like a little cheat sheet sort of for myself. So that way each time I find each of these answers, I can just simply plug them in. So that way when it comes time to put them in the formula, you have them right here and you can simply just plug each of these variables into the formula. Okay, so what we're looking at here today is a correlation between hours spent meditating. That's going to be our X variable. So these are all the hours spent meditating. And then Y is going to represent anxiety levels. So basically, I'm looking to see if there's a correlation between the number of hours spent meditating and people's anxiety levels. So obviously, the higher the number, the more hours spent meditating. The higher the number, the more anxiety the person is experiencing. Now notice that each of these X and Y's, this is going to represent one pair or one individual. So for example, this individual spent 2 hours meditating and they have an anxiety score of 7. This person spent 1 hour meditating, has an anxiety score of 7. This person spent 4 hours meditating and has an anxiety score of 3. So each of these is a pair and represents one person. Okay, so the first thing that we need to do is take a look at the formula and what we need to know here. So when we pick apart the formula, we know that we're going to need n, and n is going to be our sample size. So n for the correlation represents the number of pairs. In this case, we have 10. So if you count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. We have 10 people in our sample. So since we know that, I'm going to go ahead and plug it in here. We're also going to need the sum of x, which is going to be the summation of this column. We're going to need the sum of y, which will be the summation of this column. Then we need the sum of x squared. So what I'm going to have to do is create another column over here, and I'm going to have to square each x value. So let's do that. 4 times 4, 16. 3 squared is 9. 25, 4, 36, 4, 9, and 25. Okay, at some point I'm also going to need the sum of y squared. So we're going to do the same thing with the y values. So we're going to square each individual y just as we did each individual x. So 7 squared is 49, 49, 36, 9, 25. 9. Okay, and then lastly, we're going to need the sum of x times y. So for this last column, we're going to take each individual x and multiply by y. So each pair is going to get multiplied. So 2 times 7 is 14. 1 times 7 is 7. 4 times 3 is 12. 3 times 6 is 18. 5 times 3 is 15, 10, 4, 6, 9, and 15. Okay, now what I recommend at this point is that you go back and double check all of your work, because it's very easy to make a mistake in doing these calculations. And if you don't go back and check your work at this point, you might end up at the very end with the wrong value. So I always recommend double checking your work at every step. Okay, so the next thing we're going to do is sum up all of these columns so that way we can fill them in here. So when we add all of these values for x, we should get 33. So when you add 2 plus 1 plus 4 plus 3 plus 5 plus 2 plus 6 plus 2 plus 3 plus 5, we should come to 33. When we do the same for the y column, our sum of y will be 44. When we do the same for the x squared column, we should arrive at 133. When we do the same for the y squared column, we should get 220. And when we do the same for the x times y column, we should get 130. So just to make things easier, I'm going to go ahead and plug these values in here. So that way, again, when I'm plugging them into the formula, it's really simple, makes it a lot easier and less likely to make a mistake. So the sum of y, 44, sum of x squared, 133, y squared, 220, and sum of xy, 130. Okay, so now that I have these values, I'm ready to go ahead and start plugging them into the formula here. So let's see, hopefully you guys can still see this here. Okay, so for the top, I need to find n, so 10. And then I'm looking for the sum of xy, that's this. So I'm gonna have 10 times 130 minus the sum of x, so 33, times the sum of y, 44. And that's going to be my numerator. Now for the denominator, we need to be a little careful here, and I'll explain why in a minute. So the first thing we need is, again, n, which is 10. And we're going to multiply that by the sum of x squared. The sum of x squared is 133. And then we're going to subtract it by the sum of x, which will then be squared. So this is where students often get confused. They want to go ahead and put the 133 back in here. But what you need is the sum of x, 33, and then in the next step, we will square it. So just to kind of reiterate what we've gone over, we have n, which is 10, times the sum of x squared, which was the sum of x squared, 133, minus the sum of x, 33 squared. And then we're going to do the same thing with the y. So we have 10, again, for n, and now we need the sum of y squared, which is right here, 220, minus, again, the sum of y, 44, which we're going to square in the next step. Okay? So I'm going to go step by step doing this. All right. Okay, so when we multiply 10 by 130, we get 1300. And when we multiply 33 by 44, we get 1452. And we're going to subtract this from this. Now, in our denominator, when we multiply 10 by 133, we get 1,330. When we square 33, we get 1,089. And we're going to subtract this from this value. When we take 10 and multiply 220, we get 2,200 minus 44 squared is going to be 1936. Okay, and then we just go from there. So when we subtract 1452 by 1300, we're going to get a negative value of 152. So that's already an indication that we're going to get a negative correlation, by the way. When your numerator is negative, you know it's going to be negative. So when we take 1330 and subtract 1089, we're going to get 241. And when we take 2200 and take away 1936, we get 264. And so all that's left is to multiply these and then take the square root and divide. So let's do that. So we have negative 152 divided by the square root of, when we multiply 241 times 264, we get 63,624. When we take the square root of this value, we end with 252.237. Now I recommend that you You can round, obviously. When I did this, I got, an endless number of values. I would say rounding to at least the 10th place, but probably the 100th place is better. And so when we divide this, I'm going to get a negative 0.603. So this is R. So our R is negative 0.603. Now remember, if you do all these calculations and let's say I ended up with negative 1.1, we know that anything that exceeds negative or positive 1 is going to be incorrect. So again, always a good idea to double check your work. But in this case, I'm pretty sure, at least I hope I did this right. Okay, so this is our correlation. So the relationship strength between hours spent meditating and anxiety levels, it's pretty strong, or relatively strong if you look at the chart in the book, and it's a negative correlation. So what the negative correlation tells us is that in this case, the more hours that people spent meditating, the less anxiety they had. The less hours they spent meditating, the more anxiety they had. Okay, so in order to find then next would be our coefficient of determination, coefficient of determination, which is R squared. So when you square this negative 0.603, we are going to get 0.363. The next step is to turn this into a percentage. So we're going to move the decimal points 2 places, and so we end with 36.3%. So this 36.3% tells us what our two variables share in common, the amount of variance that they share in common. So they share 36.3% of the variance. The last step would be to find the coefficient of alienation. Unfortunately, there's no symbol for that, so I've got to write it all out. And we find that by running out of room here, but excuse the mess. 100%, and we're going to take our coefficient of determination and subtract it from the 100%. So 36.3% taken from 100% leaves us with a coefficient of alienation of 63.7%. So that's basically how you do it, and this is what you will be doing for your assignment this week. I hope that this video has been helpful and has answered any questions that you may have, and hopefully you're able to complete this on your own. Again, of course, if you have any questions, please let me know, and I look forward to seeing your responses. Thank you.